Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. So the Chinese New Year is coming up on Friday of this week, starts on the 12th of February. And I thought it would be really interesting to sort of review a bunch of issues between Canada and China in regards to Canadian-Chinese, but also U.S.-Chinese relations, because they're really top of the topic because of the change from former President Donald Trump to Joe Biden, the current president of the United States. And so I wanted to invite Charles Burton, who's a fascinating gentleman. He is currently senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and the European Value Center for Security Policy at the University of Alberta. He's got a fascinating background. He was not only educated at the University of Toronto, but also at Fudan University, where he was from 1978 to 1981. And I was actually had the privilege of being in Fudan University for a bunch of courses just a few years after that. He then did some postdoctoral fellow work at the University of Alberta. He's been an associate professor at Brock for 30 years, a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and as I mentioned, a non-resident senior fellow at the European Value Center for Security Policy. And he is an expert on China because, Charles, I think you actually were born and lived there. Is that correct?
Yes, I've lived there as a student, and I had two postings as a diplomat for Canada in Beijing. So I've spent a lot of my life in China, and I have a home there in the southwest in Yunnan province. So it's a place that I like to be, and here in Canada, I pretty much do Chinese all day, every day. My family's a Chinese speaking family, and I keep up with what's going on in China by watching the Chinese TV, which, with the miracle of the internet's available live all day long.
I was in somewhere southwest China in Guilin, where they have these array of thousands of these sandstone mountains. Is that close to where you are?
Those are the karst formations. No, I'm a bit closer to the border of Tibet, Sichuan, and Laos. So if you look at the map of China, sort of the bottom left-hand corner is where Yunnan is. It's quite a multicultural area of China because of so many Southeast Asian peoples living in those parts, the Miao, the Dai, as well as, of course, the Han Chinese. And the weather there is almost always perfect. We don't have heating or air conditioning in the house.
And how often do you get to go there?
Well, when the kids are off school, that's usually when we go.
Wonderful.
Because it keeps up. It allows them to keep up their Chinese language by being in an immersion environment. I don't see too many Caucasian people in that part of the country.
And I understand that there's something about paying your debts the day before Chinese New Year. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, the Chinese New Year, the first day of the Chinese New Year is really a starting of beginnings. So you want to clear off your debts, and people wear new clothes, and it's a time, I guess, for setting the past aside and starting fresh. So resolve your arguments and so on. So I think it's particularly appropriate to talk about what's been going on between China and the West on the last day of the old year, and hopefully we'll be seeing better things in the year of the ox.
So the year of the ox, do you believe in these different Chinese calendar animals, and what does the year of ox portell, if anything?
Well, I'm a sheep in the Chinese system and a sheep in the Western system. I mean, there are various superstitions associated with the year. It's a 16-year cycle, so the year, your own year, is not a good year. If you were born in the year of the ox 16 years ago, or 32 years ago, or 48 years ago, and it's the ox year, you have to be careful. But there's a lot of stuff about who you should get married to. I guess it's sort of like the lion laying down with the lamb or something, but there's a lot of superstition about what makes a compatible couple. So I don't know how seriously people take it, but it's in general, Chinese New Year is just a joyous time of new beginnings and getting family reunification and getting together with friends, and a lot of traditions in different parts of the country.
And will you do anything special for Chinese New Year?
Oh yes, absolutely. Yeah, new clothes, banquet, telephone calls to the family, the usual things. It's a wonderful holiday,
Excellent.
similar to our Christmas or Thanksgiving. It's got that element, and people. Right now, of course, the issue with the COVID-19 is that normally we'd have a family celebration, and of course we have to keep it small. And within China, a lot of rural people who are working in the cities want to go back to their local village to celebrate Chinese New Year. For a lot of the couples who are working in laboring jobs in the cities or domestic servants or whatever, Chinese New Year is the only time they see their parents and often their children. So, it's particularly sad if they're unable to travel due to fear of the pandemic. It means that they won't see their family for yet
A
another
long time.
year.
So you gave me a list of a whole bunch of different topics that you thought we should talk about in regards to Canada-Chinese relations in China itself. And the first one was ongoing COVID disinformation. What do you think the issue is there, sir?
Well, I think that, clearly the world wants to know how it is that this pandemic came about. And with regard to SARS, there's consensus in the scientific community about how SARS transmitted through the civet cats. With regard to COVID, the Chinese government has been very reluctant to allow international investigation of the sources of the COVID so that we can prevent it from happening again and better understand the nature of this particular virus. When Australia suggested that there be an international investigation of neutral observers, China responded very fervently, suggesting that it was completely out of Australia's place to suggest such a thing, and imposed economic coercive sanctions on Australian exports to China, which are considerable. So, the Chinese government is very, very sensitive on this particular point. They wouldn't allow the WHO to enter China to do an investigation until a year after the fact. So, it's a long delay between when one would have liked to have gone in to try and see what's going on to when it did. The delegation has completed its investigation in Wuhan. And the Chinese members of the delegation have said that it definitely didn't come from the Wuhan Virology Institute, a research institute that was doing research on these coronaviruses transmitted by bats from Yunnan, located quite close to the Huanan market. So, a logical explanation would be that there was some sort of error made in the handling of the virus research. It infected people inside the Virology Institute. They then went to the market, and and now we know that it has human-to-human transmission, and that's why it's identified with that market. Chinese have insisted that it couldn't have come from the Virology Institute, will not allow any further investigation of that, and suggest that the virus may have come to Wuhan in the packaging of seafood products. On the one hand, they say that the seafood, some of the people who got the virus worked in the seafood section of the Huanan market. On the other hand, they said, well, but it also appeared simultaneously in other parts of Wuhan. So which is it? And, I don't know much about medicine, but it seems to me that if the virus transmitted from packaging of seafood, surely the place where the seafood came from, people would have had the virus. And we don't have any evidence of any evidence that it started anywhere but in Wuhan. The Chinese are also now they're suggesting that the WHO team should start investigating in foreign countries, and China suggesting maybe it came from the United States when the U.S. military attended the World Military Games in Wuhan in November 2019, or there's a lot of it in Italy, so maybe it came from Italy. It just seems that the Chinese government's insistence that the virus could not have originated in that Virology Institute is suspicious and concerning, because so if it did, an error was made. Management of the virus in the early stages in China was clearly designed to deceive, and the thing got out of control. But things have gone wrong in other countries in the way we've been managing this pandemic, and so I think we'd rather have the truth and, not ascribe a lot of blame. But in general, when you see the Chinese government trying to cover something up, it's typically because they're concerned about their impact domestically. And so it could be the Chinese government are concerned that if it's found out that there was some error out of the Virology Institute, or that the Chinese government suppressed information resulting in the spread of this virus unnecessarily, that could then affect the people's view of the rule of the Chinese Communist Party and lead to demands for political change. So these are all the explanations, but the bottom line is that maybe it wasn't necessary that we have so many unnecessary deaths throughout the world. Maybe we didn't need to have lockdowns if the Chinese government had managed the early phases of discovering this new form of SARS way back over a year ago. Who knows? And I'm beginning to think that the Chinese government will never allow the truth to get out.
We're chatting tonight with Charles Burton, an expert on China, because of the Chinese New Year. And we just want to understand better everything that's going on in regards to Canada-China relations. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more with Mr. Burton in just a second. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. We're chatting sort of in honor of Chinese New Year with Charles Burton, who's an expert on China. He's a senior fellow with Macdonald Laurier Institute. And expert on China, was a student in China, has a house in China, and has worked as a diplomat in the embassy, the Canadian embassy in China. So he knows what he's talking about. Next issue I wanted to raise with you, Charles, is the South China Sea and Taiwan issues in regards to that. Tell me what you want to tell us about those issues, please.
Well, a few years ago, the Chinese government started to do some landfilling operations on various reefs and rocky outcroppings in the South China Sea. And the Chinese government claims nearly the entire South China Sea as Chinese territory, including areas which are very close to surrounding countries like Indonesia and Malaysia, Philippines, traditional fishing areas of those countries. And then when the Chinese government had did this landfill operations, they then started to put military bases onto these created islands. So, airstrips and port facilities were put in. So China is clearly militarizing the South China Sea. The Philippines complained to the United Nations that China was violating the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. And an investigation was made by the Permanent Court of Claims over the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and they determined that China should not have, shouldn't be building those military bases on international waters, which, is what the South China Sea has always been. So China then rejected that, saying that the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague's decision was a useless piece of paper. So it's very concerning that China would simply reject a ruling of an international body, peace and justice in affairs of maritime disputes. So countries like the United States, Canada sometimes, and Europe have been doing freedom of navigation exercises through the South China Sea, and the Chinese have been unhappy about it. Chinese military have been harassing fishermen who have been coming into their areas that they've been fishing for hundreds of years, which China now claims. And there seem to be concerns about rights of overflight of these areas that China is now saying are Chinese sovereign territory. So, this is a potential flashpoint for future war if it leads to something being sunk or shot down. Similarly, with regard to Taiwan, China's been very aggressive in recent times in flying airplanes over and around Taiwan to intimidate the people of Taiwan, who increasingly are not identifying as Chinese, but rejecting the mainland People's Republic of China claim that Taiwan is a renegade province under illegitimate rule, whereas in fact the government of Taiwan has been elected by a free and fair election. The Democratic Progressive Party of Taiwan has a political program which is very similar to Canada's. The middle class, indigenous rights, gay, lesbian, transgender rights, environment. And so, we feel that the people of Taiwan have made a legitimating choice in their government, and that Taiwan should not be ruled from Beijing, because the people of Taiwan clearly prefer democracy and freedom and prosperity that their regime has led to. So, these are two flashpoints that could lead to the next war, because they're essentially unreconcilable with between the two, as China simply insists that those areas belong to China, and the rest of the world just cannot acknowledge that.
So tell me a little bit about that. So in the 1940s, there was effectively a civil war, was there not? And the government that's in Taiwan at one point in time ruled all of China, and the current government that is ruling China kicked them out of China, and they escaped to Taiwan.
Yes, I mean, Taiwan had been a Japanese colony from 1895 to 1945, so they didn't have Chinese rule over that period of colonization. And prior to that, the connection between Taiwan and Beijing was tentative at best, or at least that's the Taiwan version of history. The mainland version suggests that Taiwan has always been an integral part of China and should return to the embrace of the motherland. But essentially, the Chiang Kai-shek regime, the nationalist regime, which was pushed out of China by the communists in 1949, did establish a government in Taiwan. But the people of Taiwan did not necessarily welcome that government, because they were from the mainland. It was an imposed regime of Mandarin speakers, whereas Taiwan speaks their own version of Chinese, and like so many places, would prefer to have a self-determination of their government. Now the mainlanders, the people who came to Taiwan from the mainland, have more or less melded into the general Taiwan population. And after that 70 years, there aren't people who identify as being a native of places inside the Chinese mainland. And so the status of Taiwan continues to be ambiguous. They still refer to themselves as the Republic of China, as opposed to, the People's Republic of China, which is mainland China. The population of Taiwan is only 1/60th that of China, so it's not even 30 million compared to 1.5 billion on the mainland. And if they were to do what I think most Taiwanese people would prefer, declare a Republic of Taiwan, have their own flag and seat on the UN, and their right to participate in international multilateral organizations, China says that they would simply invade. If there was a war between China and Taiwan, it would be a disaster, because Taiwan as an island is highly fortified, has extensive U.S. military equipment, and the United States has a commitment to defend Taiwan against attack from the mainland. So, how that would play out, one shudders to think. But combined with the South China Sea, you do see potential for a tragedy of geopolitical proportions, that no one wants to see the two major superpowers of the world engaged in a military conflict
over one island in one country. I've been to Taiwan, though, and it's incredibly prosperous and well developed, is it not?
Yes, the average standard of living in Taiwan is higher than in Canada, and it has a free press and freedom of assembly and the right of people to elect their own leaders. As for Canadians, I think Taiwan is a reflection of the potential for having a democracy based on traditional Chinese norms, because bottom line is that Taiwanese people speak Chinese and are culturally based on the great traditions of Chinese Confucianism and the other customs. And people in Taiwan will be celebrating the Lunar New Year the same as people in the mainland.
The second issue I wanted to talk about was the Belt and Road strategy that's currently being executed by China. Tell us about that, sir.
Well, the Chinese government is based on the idea of what Xi Jinping refers to as the community of the common destiny of mankind. And essentially, the Chinese Communist Party looks back to the 1840s when China was defeated militarily by the British in the First Opium War, when Britain managed to defeat China for the right to continue selling opium into China despite the Chinese government having made it illegal. And from that point, China was seen as what was called the weak man of Asia, the sick man of Asia, perhaps. And from 1840 up to 1949, there were successive foreign humiliations against China. The Japanese were able to seize a good bit of the Northeast, and the Germans had colonies in Shandong, and the British were able to control Hong Kong, and there were foreign concessions in Shanghai, and basically China was being eaten up by foreign powers. So what Mr. Xi would like to do would be to what he refers to as the great rejuvenation of China, and tells the Chinese people that it's the ambition of his government that by the year 2050, the 100th anniversary of the revolution, that China will become the dominant power on the planet and will replace the existing multilateral political and economic institutions formed after the Second World War, dominated by the United States, the WTO and the UN and so on, with new Chinese institutions. And so his doctrine is based on the idea that the United States is a power in decline and that China will assume its rightful place as the leading civilization on the planet. That it's a mythology. It's not, there's a lot of reasons to think that that's not the way it's going to be. The Belt and Road Initiative is an ambitious initiative to restructure all of the global economy to put China at the center. So this involves railways from China all the way to Spain, massive program of ports to bring foreign resources into China, including the Arctic Silk Road, where China hopes to establish trading links across the Canadian Arctic and establish a presence there. China even refers to itself as a near Arctic power, even though, if you look on the map, it's pretty far from our Arctic. So the restructuring the global economy to put China at the center through the Belt and Road fits with the community of the common destiny of mankind, which is an enormously ambitious idea that all of us, all the other powers of the world, will become subordinate to China in the center and return to a global cosmology that China had, which is that China is the sole great civilization, and the rest of us should show our respect for the greatness of China and basically set the world to rights. This is a very it's a very disturbing basis for the legitimacy of your regime, where they're playing on people's sense of humiliation over China's defeat starting with British military might in the 1840s. Putting so much emphasis on events that happened
100 years ago,
such a long time ago. And basing their self-understanding of themselves as a nation that has been humiliated by the West and should seek revenge.
But
it's a dangerous doctrine.
It appears to be working, though, isn't it? Yeah, I spent some time in business in Africa, and we saw Chinese investment and Chinese workers almost everywhere. And they said that, at one point in time, everyone was upset about the French and British and other colonialists. And then it was the imperialists from the United States that were bringing all the money. And now it was the Chinese, and all the restaurants in several hotels that I went to, the luxury end hotels, it was the Chinese businessmen that were holding court.
Yes, I think that, China's development aid comes without strings, and they tend to, feed corruption and support authoritarian dictators. China is quite happy to provide non-democratic governments in the third world with the mechanisms for internet censorship and surveillance, such as they have in China. So, and there have been issues where China has given extensive loans to third world countries that have not been well used. Maybe they end up in the Swiss bank accounts of the dictator. And then when China calls in the loans, they've demanded that the third world country turn over port facilities to the Chinese regime on 99-year leases, which allows for the potential for China to establish a military presence in those places. So some of the discussion of the Belt and Road has been reframed as debt trap diplomacy, where China is attempting to expand its geostrategic interest by giving these loans that they know will not be able to be repaid, or subsidizing infrastructure projects which are not economically feasible, and feeding on corruption in the area. But I think,
isn't that what some people said in criticism of the IMF and the World Bank and American banks, and that they would then support the Shah of Iran and less than savory people as well?
Yeah, I think you have a good point there. I think that the assessment of China's involvement in the third world is still to be made. Could they be worse than the colonial powers in those places? It's a mixed bag. I mean, certainly I know a lot of people who live in African countries who couldn't be more delighted to have Chinese cell phones. Everybody loves their smartphone, and China puts in that Huawei technology, and people get to download all the fun stuff that they can get. So, I think it's too soon to make an absolute assessment of it, but considering what we know about the intentions of the Chinese regime and its lack of trustworthiness and its willingness to violate the reciprocal norms of the rules-based order, here in Canada with the debt trap, with our hostage diplomacy, with the Chinese violation of trade contracts and other means to coerce our government to go along with what China wants in Canada, one can't help but be concerned. But that being said, as you say, the record of colonialism, particularly some
isn't all that
nations'
great
colonialism,
either.
Exactly. So they are building ports, they are building infrastructure. How it will eventually pan out in terms of the interests of people in Africa remains. But one point that you did bring up, which does cause a lot of concern for my African friends, is the Chinese insistence on using Chinese labor in their projects in third world countries, and denying the local people
employment
opportunities. And we're seeing that up in the Canadian North, where Chinese mining concerns are insisting that people who work in their mine have to be fluent in Mandarin, because they're using technology that's being supervised by engineers who can only speak Mandarin. And how many Indigenous people in the Canadian North are able to qualify for the job?
We're chatting tonight with Charles Burton, an expert on China. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back, and I'm going to ask him about this last topic we just discussed, which is Chinese cell phones and Huawei. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're chatting with Charles Burton, a China expert. He's a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. He's been a professor for 30 years at Brock. He was a student at Fudan University and a student in China. And he's got a house in southwestern China, and so he's got family in China, and so he knows a lot of what he talks about. One of the topics we just touched on, which is big in Canada, is 5G and Huawei. Charles, what do you think we should do in regards to Huawei?
Well, I think when you look at Huawei, they sell their equipment at a considerable discount compared to Samsung, Ericsson, and Nokia for the same kit. And one can't help but wonder how it is that they're able to undercut their competitors so significantly. We're talking like 30%. And their management structure and relations to the Chinese military and security agencies is murky at best. So, the Australians and the Americans say that they have solid intelligence that Huawei's installations would include, routines that would allow for Huawei to have the capability to engage in intelligence, massive downloading of databases for Chinese use, or putting kill switches into critical infrastructure. So that would allow the capability for the Chinese regime to potentially use Huawei for its advantage if push came to shove. So from that point of view, it seems that Canada is the only member of the Five Eyes Intelligence Consortium who has not decided that Huawei should not install in their telecommunication system.
Charles, what are the Five Eyes Intelligence Consortium?
Well, that's the British, the Americans, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. Canucas or
and Canada's the only one that is accepting Huawei right now.
Well, we haven't made a decision. The government keeps putting it off. Ralph Goodale, when he was still in government before the last election, said that Canada would be making a decision before the election. Well, that election is long past. And so, I think a lot of people have concern that if the Liberals come back into power with a majority, that they will make a decision in favor of Huawei. And the United States has made it clear to Canada that if we install Huawei 5G into our telecommunications, that this will impact the willingness of the United States to share critical intelligence with us, because Canada will be seen as a weak link in the alliance. And we're a net consumer of intelligence from the United States. It would be very bad in terms of the north, the border, and so on, if we were cut off from this important consortium. So it's hard to know why the government continues to want to go with Huawei.
It's cheaper.
It's cheaper, and I think that there are, significant, important corporate interests in Canada who are beholden to Huawei, who also have influence with government, and so, if they make the decision, it'll lead to a lot of flack for the government. As they don't make the decision, it leads to uncertainty for telecommunications companies who are already making plans to put in Ericsson and Nokia.
Tell me what you think about this CFO of Huawei that is in court in Vancouver, and hostage diplomacy, and these two Canadians that are captive in China.
Well, it's very worrying. I mean, basically, it's puzzling as to why the Chinese Communist Party, of which Meng Wanzhou is a very senior member, allowed Ms. Meng to travel to Canada when they knew that the United States, the District Court of Western New York, had put out a warrant for her arrest on serious charges of bank fraud. So, and knowing that Canada has a much used extradition treaty with the United States, why would they allow her to touch base in Canada? You would have thought that someone would have checked the list of countries that have extradition treaties with the United States and decided Ms. Meng shouldn't go there. When she was detained, Chinese government felt that a mistake had been made, that surely Canada wouldn't dare to detain a member of the red nobility just because the United States wanted us to do so. But, we have a treaty obligation, and the United States prepared a request for her detainment. And now we have a long process, not of determining whether she's guilty of the serious charges the U.S. has leveled against her, but simply as to whether the extradition request is consistent with the extradition treaty. How it takes year after year for, the judge and her lawyers and the government lawyers to make a simple determination as to whether the extradition is valid under the terms of the treaty is, a complete mystery.
It seems like it's gone on forever.
Well, it's gone on since December 2019. So, and our guys, Michael Kovrig and Michael Sfaver, who are, not guilty of anything but being in the wrong place, the wrong time, have been held in Chinese prison hell for 780 days because the Chinese government is convinced if they put enough pressure on the government of Canada that we will simply abrogate our obligations to the United States and release Ms. Meng back to China. The most recent attempt was where she asked that her bail conditions be loosened, that she not be subject to 24/7 monitoring by a security company and be allowed to wander around unsupervised in the city of Vancouver. The judge didn't buy that one, but the idea that Chinese criminal gangs would attempt to extract her, like Mr. Golson was extracted from Japan, would make a terrific movie that I would be one of the first to buy the ticket to. But this could go on as long as a decade, believe it or not, with delays and appeals. And Canada-China relations are completely frozen over this period. Our ambassador doesn't get any access in Beijing, and the Chinese are simply, I think that the Chinese regime is very sensitive about their capacity to protect the members of their senior elite from foreign interference.
So what should the Canadian government do? Nothing, and just let the judicial system work?
Well, my feeling is that we ought to make a decision sooner rather than later. And apparently it's not appropriate for the Minister of Justice to interfere in court scheduling. But, she has a hearing and then months go on before the next hearing. I feel that it should be in the national interest a priority case. And then at the very end of it, after all the appeals and delays have been exhausted, the Minister of Justice does have the right to make a final determination as to whether the extradition will go through in the national interest. So, a lot of people are urging that we should, get the Minister of Justice in there earlier and simply declare that Ms. Meng should not be sent to the United States, returned to China. But if we do that, then the Chinese government will feel that their hostage diplomacy and economic coercion, such as the barring of, the violation of our canola contracts, which, who would have thought those little black seeds are a $3 billion a year Canadian business, has worked and opens up the Chinese regime to engage in further coercion, for example, to try and force a favorable decision on Huawei 5G, which the regime is extremely keen to have put into our telecommunications. So, we're really stuck between a rock and a hard place here. And I guess, the best thing is for us to let the process take its place. There's always a possibility that her lawyers will be successful in arguing that there was some violation of her rights at the Vancouver airport when they made some errors in the handling of her telephone, her cell phone, or something along those lines, or that it's actually political and not based on a violation of justice. But doesn't look like it. Chances are that the extradition request is valid, and then she goes to the United States and she'll have ample opportunity to defend herself under the due process of law in the States. If we didn't think the United States justice system was compatible with our own principles of justice, then we wouldn't have an extradition treaty.
Charles, I'm speaking to you from Mississauga. We have a fairly significant Muslim population. The issue of potential genocide against Muslims in China comes up in conversations with my friends, my Muslim friends, all the time. Tell me what's going on there.
Well, the Chinese government used to have a policy of encouraging minority peoples living in China to have a high degree of autonomy and maintain their language and cultural traditions. Similar to what happened when the British defeated the French in Quebec and allowed for the maintenance of the Roman Catholic religion and French language education there. The Chinese government, consistent with what we've been talking about, which is that Chinese civilization is seen by the regime as being rightfully the dominant civilization for all people everywhere, has reversed its policy, is concerned about independentist sentiment among the Turkic Muslims in the northwestern part of China, an area referred to as Xinjiang in Chinese, which means the new border areas, and which the Uyghur population, the Muslim population there, referred to as East Turkestan. They would like to have their own independent country, where their own language and religion are allowed to be freely practiced. The Chinese government has established a network of prison camps where they are taking all the Uyghurs who seem to have any kind of national identity issues into these camps where they're engaged in severe brainwashing to force them to give up their religious belief and to abandon their language in favor of Mandarin. So people are put into these camps, which are covered with razor wire, guard towers, and men with guns. The Chinese say are vocational training institutions to reduce terrorism and give them life skills, but really amount to concentration camps. And they keep them for years in these facilities until they're broken, and then they release them to work in essentially under forced labor conditions, continuing to be highly supervised. But other revelations have come out about the Chinese treatment of the Turkic Muslims, specifically the forced imposition of birth control to reduce the fertility of women. And more recently, a BBC report, really quite horrifying, that documents pervasive rape and sexual abuse of women inside the facilities by Han Chinese. So, BBC, I think, is quite a reputable source. So it does meet.
So it sounds like it's a genocide.
It meets, if you look at the Genocide Convention and the criteria that determine what is genocide, it clearly seems to meet those criteria. So, if the Chinese say it's not so, that it's all fabricated, but we've got satellite imagery of these prison camps. We've got video of people being forced into them. If there isn't genocide going on in China, why don't they allow the UN to send in a delegation to investigate and verify that the Chinese claims that these Muslims are going there willingly because they're seeking educational opportunities are true? Chinese, of course, will not do that. So it leads to all sorts of issues. Like, does Canada go to an Olympics where we'll have to make nice to the representatives of a regime who are complicit in genocide? Do we continue to trade with China and receive products, specifically cotton products that may have been produced by forced labor of people who are subject to these genocidal policies? Something like 80% of the cotton in China comes from that region. So there are many, many issues that impinge on our economic interests. And the Commons Foreign Affairs Committee subcommittee on Human Rights and International Development had hearings on the situation in Xinjiang and among the Uyghur people and determined that it is genocide. But up to now, the government of Canada is not prepared to say that word. And so we're left in a kind of ambiguous situation where there seems to be consensus that something terrible is going on there, but our government refuses to respond to it in any kind of meaningful way.
What do you think we should do?
Well, I think that I think that we have to draw a line and start to ensure that Canadians are not consuming products that are produced by labor in those areas. That that we should declare the Chinese communist officials that we know are complicit in the genocidal policies under our Magnitsky Law unable to visit Canada and seize their assets. In Canada, a lot of Chinese officials have extensive investment in Canada of monies of doubtful provenance in Vancouver real estate. And, there's a lot of talk of money laundering through casinos and real estate in BC, that we ought to at least make some symbolic gestures towards this, and hopefully in concert with like-minded allies, so that the Chinese will not single us out for retaliation. But even if they do retaliate, our total external trade is 4% that goes to China. It's basically agricultural commodities. We could seek markets elsewhere. We don't have to be
complicit in
complicit in this kind of thing.
supporting genocide.
Canada should be doing the right thing and standing up for the rights of the
I
Turkic
certainly agree
Muslims.
with you on that we should be doing the right thing. Charles Burton, thank you so much. We're going to take a break and come back with Charles for some concluding comments. I want to ask him about Hong Kong before we're done. Stay with us. Well, we're having an interesting, I think actually a fascinating but concerning conversation with Charles Burton, an expert on China, about China. Tomorrow is Chinese New Year. Tonight is the night before. And Charles tells us that on the eve of the New Year, you have to pay your debts. You have to sort of solve all your arguments, and you have to clear your mind and pay all your debts. And so I'm not sure if we're doing that, but we're certainly having a good, frank conversation about a lot of issues. Charles, I can't let you go without asking you about the status of Hong Kong and what's going on there.
Well, I think it's a great concern to Canada. There are 300,000 Canadian citizens resident in Hong Kong. The Chinese government has recently indicated that they are not prepared to recognize the Canadian status of the Canadians in Hong Kong because of that they see them as Chinese, even though they're Canadian passport holders. Hong Kong was reverted from Chinese to British sovereignty, from British to Chinese sovereignty in 1997, and the conditions of that was a policy of one country, two systems, that Hong Kong would be allowed to maintain its freedoms of speech and assembly, and that there would be no change for 50 years. So Hong Kong should have been allowed to maintain its free status until 2047, and that the Chinese, that the people of Hong Kong would be allowed to elect their leaders by 2017. Chinese government has reneged on all of those things and recently put in a national security law, which has resulted in a large number of people of democratic disposition being arrested in Hong Kong and sent to China for trial. So when the Sino-British Joint Declaration of 1984 was put together to try and come up with these conditions for the transition of Hong Kong from British to Chinese sovereignty, at the request of the government of China and the request of the government of Great Britain, Canada endorsed the Sino-British Joint Declaration. It was lodged with the UN. Now China is violating the terms of that by the imposition of this new law. And the question is, what does Canada do? Don't we have a moral obligation to welcome people who would be subject to persecution under the national security law to come to Canada and resettle with their families here? We have something in the order of 500,000 Canadians who identify as of Hong Kong origin. So far, our government has not agreed to do that. I think it's a tragedy in the making, and to some extent, Canada is culpable for not taking our international responsibility to the Sino-British Joint Declaration seriously, and not standing up for the freedoms of people in Hong Kong. And of course, there's the economic element, which is that Hong Kong no longer being based on rule of law and transparency and freedom of information means that economic interests will suffer as well, as it's no longer a place where the economic environment is up to international standards. And, corruption comes in.
What do you think? What do you think Canada should do?
Well, I think that we should be allowing people from Hong Kong to come here to Canada to seek refuge without a lot of question. The Hong Kong immigrants have done very well in our country. They have good English. They're typically well educated and successful in business. So, these are people that we need more of, not less. And I think we have a moral obligation to say to people in Hong Kong who would like to come to Canada, you're welcome to come here and seek refuge. And hopefully, when the political conditions change, you may be able to return to your lives in Hong Kong.
Charles, tomorrow is Chinese New Year. Do you have a message to anyone listening tonight, whether of Chinese origin or not, for Chinese New Year?
Well, I think, it's a time of new beginnings. The year of the ox is on the way, and one hopes that this will be a much better year for relations between China and the West. And, Happy New Year, everybody.
How do you say Happy New Year in Mandarin?
Gong xi fa cai, which means wish you happiness and that you'll become wealthy in the new year.
Gong si fatse. Thank you so much for joining us. Really
Take
appreciate it. And I really appreciate you addressing all the different issues that we talked about. It was really quite a comprehensive conversation. Thank you, Charles Burton. I really appreciate it.
It's been great to speak with you.
That's our show for tonight. Thanks for joining us, and Happy New Year.